Most business owners pick a structure when they start and never think about it again. Your accountant says, set up a company or go with a trust. You sign the paperwork and that's it, done. You move on to actually running the business. But the structure that works at 100,000 in revenue can cost you real money at 500,000. And by the time you're doing 2 million, it can actively trap you. And I'm not talking about just tax. Your structure determines who's liable if something goes wrong, whether you can bring in a partner, how much you can pay your family, and how much of your revenue actually stays working for you instead of going straight to the ATO. I've taken my own business from 500,000 to 5 million a year in revenue over the last 13 years. And my structure today looks nothing like the one I started with. I've restructured multiple times along the way, and I've guided hundreds of clients through the same transitions. So I want to walk you through the right structure at every stage of growth, the triggers that tell you it's time to upgrade, and how to make the switch without a tax bill. But before we get into the stages, here's how I actually think about structure. It comes down to 4 factors, and the weighting shifts as you grow. The first is risk. Who's liable if the business gets sued? The second is revenue. How much are you making and how much of it are you keeping? The third is people. Who are you paying, and is there a surplus beyond what your family needs to live on? And the fourth is growth. Do you want to bring in business partners or offer equity to your team or eventually sell? At each stage of the business, 1 or 2 of these factors dominate. And the mistake I've seen over and over is business owners making a structured decision based on one factor, usually tax, and completely ignoring the others. So let's start at the beginning. If you're just starting out and your revenue is anywhere from 0 to 200,000, the answer is simple: sole trader. It's a structure with minimal compliance, no entity fees, and the lowest amount of admin. At this stage, you're focused on getting the business off the ground, and the tax difference at this stage is negligible. So you're better off keeping costs low and putting your energy into generating revenue. The mistake at this stage is overcomplicating it. I had a startup come to me recently when their previous accountant had set up a trading company, a separate IP company, corporate trustees for each founder, unit trusts for each founder, and family trusts for each of them as well. There were 10 entities, and the business hadn't made $1 yet. I mean, it's good for the accountant because that's 10 sets of fees to charge, but terrible for the business owner. You don't need a truck when a bicycle will do. So start simple. But watch out for one trigger, because it overrides everything else regardless of what your revenue looks like. The moment you hire your first employee, or you're doing work that carries physical risk like trades, construction, or any kind of client-facing service, you need a company. As a sole trader, if the business gets sued, you get sued. Your house, your savings, and your personal assets are all on the line because there's nothing separating you from the business. A company creates that separation, and at this stage, that's the only reason you need one. The next stage I call your first upgrade, and it's usually when revenue starts to exceed $200,000. This is where 2 things start converging. You've almost certainly got employees or contractors by now, which means real liability, and you're paying meaningful tax at personal tax rates that a company structure would reduce. But I always lead with the risk conversation because that's what actually should make you act. If you're a sole trader at this level, you've probably got staff, equipment, maybe vehicles, and clients relying on deliverables. If something goes wrong, whether that's an injury on site or a contract dispute or a supplier claim, there's nothing between the business and your personal assets. As I mentioned earlier, a company fixes that. And then the tax benefit compounds on top. If you're making $300,000 a year in profit, the difference between the top personal tax rate and the 25% company tax rate is roughly going to be $32,000 per year. We're doing this right now with a plumber client who I'll call Tom. His business is growing. He's just hired his first apprentice, and as a sole trader, he was carrying all of the liability personally. He needed a company for the protection first, and the tax savings came with it. Something we're using to help him restructure is called the Small Business Restructure Rollover, which lets you transfer your business from a sole trader into a company without triggering capital gains tax. So you can start simple, upgrade at the right time, and then switch when you're ready, which costs almost nothing. One caveat though is that a company isn't a magic shield. If you're a director and you trade while insolvent, or you miss PAYG withholding or super payments, the ATO can issue a director penalty notice and come after you personally. The protection only works if you run the company properly. Stage 3 is where you're building wealth and your revenue is anywhere from $400,000 and above. This is where structure stops being just about the business and starts being about your family. At this level, you're paying yourself and your spouse as well. There's surplus beyond what you need to live on, and the question shifts from how do I run my business efficiently to where does the surplus go and how do I protect what I'm building? Asset protection here becomes critical. You're running a business with real value, real contracts, real exposure, and if everything is sitting behind your name, it's all at risk if something goes wrong. I've never owned our family home in my name, always been in my wife's name or in a structure she controls, because I'm the one running the business and taking on all the risk. If something happens with my business, I don't want our home to be exposed. So that's a decision I made early on, and I'd recommend it to any business owner. This is where the family trust comes into play, but it's not in the way most people use it. The trust doesn't run the business and it doesn't do the investing, but rather it becomes the shareholder of your companies. That separates the person taking the risk, which is you, from the entity controlling the assets. If something goes wrong in the trading company, the trust's shareholding in your other companies is protected. And this is where a bucket company comes in as well. Any surplus profits from the trading company gets distributed across to a separate investment company, taxed at 25 to 30%. The money stays in the company and gets invested and compounds at the lower tax rate because it's a separate entity from your trading company. If the trading business gets sued, your investments aren't exposed. Here's the maths on why this matters. Say you've got $100,000 in surplus profit. If you pull it all out personally, you're paying tax up to 47%. That leaves you $53,000 to invest. If you keep it in a company at 25% tax rate, you've got $75,000 working for you. That's $22,000 more capital compounding every single year. Over 10 or 20 years, that gap is enormous. One warning here. If you're a personal services business like consulting, IT contracting, or certain trades, check the personal services business rules before trying to split income through a structure. I've seen people set up a $3,000 trust, start distributing to family members and get it all reclassified by the ATO, which means back taxes, penalties, and interest. It's not worth the risk if the PSI or the PSB rules apply to you. The last stage is what I call the scaling stage. And usually this applies if your revenue is above $2 million. At this level, the structural questions change completely. Tax and asset protection are still important, but the growth factor now dominates because it determines what your business can actually become. If you ever want to bring in a partner or a key employee or an outside investor, a company is the only structure that lets you do it cleanly. You can issue shares, sell equity, and set up employee share schemes. A trust can't do any of that. I've got 2 clients, both run architecture firms, both in the $5 to $10 million revenue range, and both wanted to bring in employees as part owners. One was in a company, so it was straightforward. We either issue new shares or the existing shareholders sell some of theirs. The incoming person gets a defined ownership stake, and it's all documented in the shareholders agreement. The other was in a unit trust. To bring someone in, we had to do a restructure to a company and swap the units for shares using a rollover. Now, this can be done, but it ends up being a high cost with a lot of admin work. It worked, but it was months of work that wouldn't have been necessary if they'd been a company from the start. And then I had a guy who actually found us through one of my videos. He wanted to buy into a business for $450,000, but the business was in a family trust and you can't buy into someone else's family trust. So now they're looking at doing a full restructure to a company plus the stamp duty costs and all the admin. That's a growth opportunity that gets delayed and almost lost because the structure was wrong. At this stage, you also want to think about separating risk from value. You might want the trading business in one company and the IP for the really valuable assets in another. If the trading company gets sued, the crown jewels aren't exposed. This is a risk decision more than a tax decision. And then there's the question of exiting. How your business structured affects the sale price and what buyers are willing to pay. A clean company structure with clear shareholdings is attractive. A mess of trusts and entities with Division 7A problems and unclear ownership makes buyers walk away or discount the price. So regardless of which stage you're at right now, the question is the same. Has your structure kept up with your business, or are you still running on the setup you had on day one? If your business has grown, but your structure hasn't changed since day one, that gap is probably costing you. And it might not be just about the tax. It could be a liability that you don't know you're carrying, or growth you can't access, or wealth that isn't protected. But none of this really matters if you can't generate a profit to make it all worthwhile. If you want to go deeper on how I learned to run a profitable business, check out this video here.